come from this feeling of being well fed, nourished. I suspect from calmness, intention, maybe not having tons of foodstuffs in the house given the limits of Flagstaff. Instead, there was the bounty from the garden.
Flipping the table.
Happy Indigenous Peoples Day, also known as Thanksgiving. Today I have the pleasure of conversing with a dear friend of many years, Deborah Madison. She and her artist husband, Patrick McFarlane, are part of my inner circle of good people with whom I love to spend time talking art, food, wine, farming, ranching, and the nation's current challenges. Deborah is popularly known as the Queen of Greens because she founded in 1979 the renowned Greens Restaurant in San Francisco, which was the nation's first vegetarian restaurant to be heralded as a white linen upscale establishment, on par with Chez Panisse in Berkeley and Parker Bosley's New American Bistro in Cleveland. These establishments were all defining the new American cuisine and the farm-to-table experience before it was even named. Moreover, Deborah is known globally because no author has written more vegetarian cookbooks. She literally redefined what is possible with the vegetables at the center of the plate. Deborah has finally put out a memoir, and it is very entertaining, informative, and reflects a life well lived. Born in the East, raised in Davis, California, where her father taught at the university, Deborah lives today outside Santa Fe in New Mexico in a beautiful adobe home filled with Patrick's art. She has traveled the world as a culinary icon, but always remained grounded, humble, and a joy to engage in good conversation. I don't want to spoil what is to come, so let's dive into my conversation with Deborah Madison. Well, Deborah, it's so good to be talking to you, even by phone.
You too, Michael. I love talking with you.
Yeah, it's nice to be with you. Wish we could have done this in person, but we're living in a time when you can't do that. So
I know we can't even do anything for Thanksgiving or cook for our friends or anything.
I know it's a great weird tragedy. So before we get started with the conversation, I'd love you to read from the final section of the book called Nourishment, which is my favorite section because it's so you can just see the stories that you tell in these little vignettes. So would you mind reading Ernie's Lunch?
Ernie's Lunch, I'd be happy to read it. Shall I start now?
Please.
When I moved to Flagstaff, I had a few goals. One was to start life afresh, to be out of the Bay Area and away from everything that kept defining me as I had been known, mainly as a Zen student and the chef of greens. Another goal was to learn a sport, so I bought a mountain bike and took up that perilous form of riding. And the third was to learn to barrel race, and my mentor was Ernie Macy, a former cowboy, then in his 80s, who dreamed of moving to Colorado where the water was. He had 2 quarter-horse stallions, Pride and Cochise, and we rode them in the cinder fields that spread out east of Flagstaff. I always carried a canteen on our rides, and Ernie always looked at it, then stared into space and drawled, "Water just makes you thirsty." I can only imagine what he would make of our hydration-obsessed culture today. One day, Ernie invited me to lunch. It was summer. I wasn't at all hungry, and I had company coming that evening to cook for. I didn't really want to go, but it was a kind gesture, and without thinking much about it, I accepted the invitation. The menu consisted of a large steak from Smith's, fried in salad oil, 2 foods I would never buy or eat on my own. There was also sliced zucchini, cooked for about 40 minutes, and an entire stick of marjoram, another food I didn't eat, the margarine, that is. Surprisingly, it was a delicious meal. That soggy, overcooked zucchini really tasted like squash, and though I wasn't much of a steak eater, the steak was good too, really good. I recall nothing else about the menu, but I have a sweet memory memory of Ernie cooking at his little stove in 2 cast iron skillets and this big smile when I said, "This is so good," and meant it. And all the reasons I hadn't wanted to come to lunch disappeared completely. Everything got done. I went to the airport. I cooked for my friends and ate dinner with them. I may have been too full, but decades later, I still recall Ernie's lunch with pleasure.
I love that. It's a beautiful story because it's about acceptance. And I think of the time we're living in, this rural urban split, and how
Mm-hmm.
that meal, that experience, kind of erased that split.
Yeah, I think I'm glad to hear you say that. I think we are living in a very difficult time where there are lots of splits around food in particular. I don't encounter it so much where I live, which is in a very rural community, and with my husband, Patrick. But I know that people have remarked upon the tendency of vegans and various other dietary people to be very aggressive about it and make it hard to sit down at a table together. And this book is really about what it takes to sit down to the table together. And my model for that is actually Richard McCarthy,
Mm-hmm.
who, when he was the president of Slow Food, we ate together at a meal in Denver, and it was all pork and stuff. And he was so incredibly nice and decent in his way of being a vegetarian that nobody minded, and he got to eat lots of vegetables where the rest of us had to eat a lot of pickles and a lot of pork.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. That's beautiful. Richard's a good man.
Yeah, he is.
And you write about that actually in the book. I remember that in the book. So
I do. Yeah.
about that experience. So that brought a question up I want to jump to, but we'll get to it when we talk about local flavors. But so let's talk about I know you were born in the East, but I want to begin with your early life, your childhood in the Central Valley of California, outside Davis.
Mm-hmm.
So, how do you think that influenced you living in Davis, California?
Oh, I think it influenced me a lot. I mean, I actually loved living there, and I loved growing up in California. It's so important to me, and I still feel that I'm a Californian, even though I haven't lived there for 30 years or more.
Mm-hmm.
I go back very often. I see it. I talk to people who live there. I'm friends with you, for example,
Mm-hmm.
who is very much a Californian.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you have a question in particular?
Well, I'm just wondering if you think that, one of the reasons that you ended up focusing on food, but you are a cook. You are known as a cookbook writer, but actually, your books are much deeper than that. I mean, they bring in, like in Local Flavors, you bring in a lot about the importance of farmers markets to communities and the values and the farming struggles. In vegetable literacy, you get into the depth of understanding of the history of vegetables. I mean, that book is I've learned so much from that book about vegetables. So you're not a cookbook writer. I don't think of you as a cookbook writer.
I'm so glad to hear that.
So I'm just wondering if all that orientation grew out of, Davis is a place where where they study agriculture and food and.
Well, at the time I was at Davis, I really wasn't that interested in food, and I went through all of this kind of evolutionary stuff with food very naively. I didn't know about it. I didn't think about it. I didn't really care about it. And now I'm amazed every time I'm on the internet and I see a reference to Davis and the ag school, and I think, oh yes, I was there. My dad was there. He was a botany teacher, and all of that. But for the most part, I don't know how it influenced me. But I love California, and I do write about the time we moved out to California, and and how spoiled you are once you've lived in California. Even if it's going to change terribly the way Tom Philpott suggests that it is, and so forth, you still have this deep, abiding affection for the Valley, for California on the whole. And I do feel that very strongly.
Yeah, and I mean, you drive through the valley. You talk about driving through the valley when you come up from New Mexico to home. You drive the valley, or you drive, and you talk about what you see. And yeah, it's so I can see the through line, right? Because you did grow up in this place that is a place of study around food systems and agriculture, and you have done that in your own way through your cooking and your writing and all the research it must take to do that.
Oh yeah, lots of research.
Yeah,
for sure.
You can see that. So, the book is interesting in that you talk about the 20 lost years, the years that you hadn't really talked about publicly, the years that you were a Buddhist monk, and how do you feel that influenced you now? That 20 years. Why don't you just give people a quick breakdown of what those years were like, how you came to it, because that's interesting, and then what you think you might have gained from that.
Well, what I might have gained from it, I have no idea. I just live my life, and that's been a part of it. But when I was 16 or so, we had a radio station in our house, which was called KPFA, and it was a very radical, listener-supported radio station at that time. And it was the only station, it still is, and it's the only station that was on. And Alan Watts used to talk twice a week. His program was recorded and replayed.
And he was the great philosopher, right? He was a philosopher, a professor at Berkeley.
East and West.
Right.
And my dad used to listen to it, so I listened to it too if it was on, because I was in the house. And he was once talking about Buddhist monks with their begging bowls and vowing to receive offerings. And in my mind's eye, I could see them so clearly. And I knew that I had to address the big questions of life somehow, some way. But at that time, it just seemed not the right time. I was just going steady. I was interested in boys and clothes and, and other things. And it was really a bit scary. But eventually it did come to pass. And I did go to Japan. And I came back and I went to a sesshin, which is a 7-day long period of meditation. And it was my first sesshin. And actually, I do write about that in the book, and about the food, because I remember the food was so simple. We had for lunch a bowl of white rice with a few sesame seeds on top, a thin miso soup, and pickles. And it just wiped me out. It was so extraordinary to eat such simple food and find so much flavor in it. And it wasn't just because my legs hurt or because I was tired or anything like that. It just really impressed me. And I moved into the Zen Center right after sesshin. And, it was a very interesting experience. It went on for 20 years. And I worked as a cook. I had many positions at Zen Center, actually. They weren't all food related. I was also a director for a while. But a lot of them were food related.
And it led to Greens.
And that led to Greens, because at Tassajara, we had a lot of guests who came down. Now, originally, the food at Tassajara, when we bought it, was very meat-centered, lamb chops and that sort of thing. And we quickly changed to a vegetarian menu, partly because that's what we ate, and we were familiar with that food. And the guests were very accepting because they had no other place to go unless they wanted to take a long drive over a treacherous path.
Yeah, that road is incredible. I've been there, Tassajara. It's amazing, that road.
It is. It is. And that's assuming that they had driven down and they had a car to do that with. But most people didn't want to do that. They were relaxed. They were hungry, and the food at Tassajara was a little bit like eating outdoors, like a picnic or something, although it wasn't at all. It was the guests ate on a guest dining room perched over a river, the Tassajara Creek, which was flowing like crazy, at least in the beginning of the summer, and they were given this food to eat. And that did lead indirectly to first the Tassajara Bakery, because we had such good baked goods, and then to Greens, because so many of our customers, or practitioners, or whatever you want to call them, our guests, were from the Bay Area. And they said, couldn't you do a restaurant here? Well, that took a while, but we eventually did open Greens.
Which kind of set the bar for vegetarian meals. I remember the first time I went there, I was like, wow. And first of all, I thought it was a very beautiful restaurant because of the view and the wood and the back room. We used, actually, Roots of Change used that back room a few times. You were gone by then, but we would use that for meetings. We would invite people and do a lunch and have a meeting in that back room. It's a beautiful restaurant, and it set the standard really for the nation around vegetarian cooking, don't you think?
Well, I hope it did. I mean, that was partly our intention. I had worked at Chez Panisse before then, and it really influenced me a lot. Plus, I had always felt that vegetarian food should be beautiful. It should be lovely. It should be charming. It should be delicious. It should, evoke those kinds of responses in people. Not, it's vegetarian, therefore it's good for me, or something like that. I wanted it to leap off the plate and just charm people to death. And I think it did do that.
It did. It did. Yeah, I didn't even actually. For me, because I'm an omnivore, as you know, so I didn't even really think about it when I was eating there, because the food, you don't think about meat missing. You don't notice that because the food is so good.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
That was always the highest compliment, when people would come into the kitchen and say they didn't even miss the meat.
Yeah.
And I thought, oh, great, that's wonderful to hear.
Yeah. So before we leave this thing, or this thought about Buddhism in California, I mean, this all took place in California. The thing that I see, the through line, is that Buddhism requires a kind of discipline, and it's a pattern of being. That, I mean, even the way you describe the food, the simplicity of the food, it's like the difference between the type of cooking that you do versus, let's say, Trotter. You mentioned Charlie Trotter in your book, and how they cook, or what's the restaurant in Napa? It's just escaping my brain right now. That's the French Laundry. I mean, the difference between the French Laundry cookbooks and your cookbooks is so interesting because of the way you do menus. I mean, the way you do ingredients and the way you cook. It is a simple, fresh, natural approach. It's not over-processed. Like, I can't even use the French Laundry cookbook because it's just so complex. So there is a simplicity in the Buddhist menu that has really, it seems to me, influenced you in some way. Do you think that's true?
I don't know. I mean, it's hard to say because I was so much a part of it on both sides. I'm being a Zen student beforehand and then running Greens much later at the end of my stay there. It's a little bit hard to separate all of that out. And also, as the head cook at Zen Center, I created a lot of the food because, at first it was very macrobiotic and stodgy because we didn't really know how to cook. It was pointed out to me very firmly that the question, what is that, should never arise when you sit down to dinner, to a plate of food. And so I tended to make food a little bit more normal, things that were recognizable. Lasagna is very recognizable. we know the foods that are recognizable.
Mm-hmm.
And I had to do that for a while before I could really branch out at greens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then the other thing I think about with you is that writing is a discipline. Dan Imhoff is a friend, and you know Dan, and he talks about the need to be disciplined, like to get up every day and write a little bit, and Buddhism is that way, right? You have a discipline, and so what is? I mean, how did you discover that you wanted to be a writer? Because you are obviously a writer. 15 books now with this one. That's incredible. I mean, that's a lot of books. That takes a lot of focus. I mean,
I guess it does. Yeah.
Do you feel like when you get up in the morning? I mean, are you always thinking about something you're going to write?
Not necessarily. I mean, this period that we're in right now with the pandemic has created a lot of confusion about that issue. But when I was writing cookbooks, I got up every morning and wrote. It was not a problem to do that, actually. It was easy to do that. I like writing. And you asked the question about how I got started or something like that.
Yeah, how did you come to write?
Well, the Greens cookbook, I kind of felt we should do it because I was, as a chef, so many people came in the kitchen and asked for recipes. And I had suggested it to the board at Zen Center, and they didn't think it was a good idea. But there was a night when we stayed up, Dan Welch and I went camping on the Roden Crater in Arizona on our way to New Mexico. We stayed up and thought about what we might want to do. And I decided I could write a cookbook by myself. I didn't need the Zen Center to do it. And that's how I got started with writing. And each book has its own focus and goal. And this was to represent the food as a restaurant. So it was a bit complex, you might say, because we did everything from scratch, and we had a big group, a crew of 10 people in the kitchen every morning that could do it. But still, I didn't want people to be disappointed in the results. Other books have other goals, and I discovered when I wrote the Greens Cookbook that I really liked it. I liked writing. And so then I moved to Flagstaff, I wrote Savory Way, and then I came here to New Mexico and I wrote Local Flavors, and it just unfolded like that.
Mm-hmm. Well, the Savory Way, I do want to talk about the Savory Way because that was the first cookbook I ever bought. And as you know, it was because I saw you in Good Morning America, some morning show. I can't remember exactly what show it was, but I saw you do you were cooking something, and I guess I was like in a store soon after that, and I saw it, and I bought it. And of all my cookbooks, it's probably that and The Joy of Cooking, which was the second cookbook I bought, are the most used. And I think it's because I don't know. The first thing I ever cooked, I think I made was the spicy Moroccan butter thing you had, which I used on squash. I think you suggested, I think this came out about 1990, and I was just starting to really cook then. And that was so exciting and so good. And I was like, wow, this is amazing. I didn't even know. I did not even notice it was a vegetarian cookbook. That's how. I didn't even think about that. It's so interesting.
Huh. That is interesting that you didn't.
Yeah.
Yes, I do. I actually like that book, and there are changes I would make. I mix a lot of vinegars and things together. We have a different vocabulary around olive oil today than we did then. But basically, I like that food very, very much, and thank you for mentioning it. I think it's good.
Yeah, it's one of my favorite cookbooks. It really is. It's a beautiful book. Plus, the title, The Savory Way. It's so simple, but compelling. And when I think of that Moroccan spicy butter, that kind of captures the feeling for me. The salsa verde I've cooked, and I think is it pan-fried potatoes? I can't remember exactly, but with cheese and rosemary and sage. I mean, those things are delicious, and the book, the title of the book really captures them. So then let's talk about Local Flavors, because that's the first book. That's actually when I met you, 2002. I think you were out talking about the book. It was some slow food event. It might have been in Italy, actually. We might have been in Italy at the Slow Food Awards. Did you go to that?
Yes, I did.
Yeah, I think you were there. I think that's where I met you, and I think that's where I met Patrick.
Huh.
I
thought it was another time later. I went to the Slow Food Awards in Bologna.
Yes.
Before we met.
Okay.
And that was wonderful. I loved that event. It was great. I don't even remember how it is I got there or why I went, but I did, and it was so exciting.
Yeah, it was exciting. Those were beautiful events. I mean, they made me cry because you had all these incredible people around the world saving endangered foods, and they were from tribes and herders, and it was just incredible stuff that we saw.
Yeah, it was. So savory. Oh yeah, local
flavors. Yeah, talk about why you did that book.
Sure,
and what it
is.
What it is. Yeah.
Okay, it is a book that's a survey of farmers markets, and I wrote it because I had just moved from Flagstaff, Arizona, to New Mexico, partly because they had a farmers market, and so the first day I was here, I went to the farmers market. I overheard somebody saying they could use some help. I said, well, I can help you. And so I ended up helping run a market for a couple of years. And I was so impressed with how markets around the country sprang up on the weekend, and they were run by volunteers, and it was such a huge effort for everybody to do it. And I thought, I'd really like to know more about this and go around the country and visit markets, which I did. I visited about 100 markets. And I didn't write a market book about our market because I felt it was not really, I didn't feel that urge to do it. We were so small and so hidden in a way. But I wanted to write about the phenomena of farmers markets. And actually, Local Flavors has a few meat recipes in it because meat was appearing in markets, and I felt that was important. And the book was really about markets. It wasn't so much about me and my taste. So I included a couple of meat recipes, but along with fruit and beans and corn and vegetables, of course, because that's what farmers markets were known for.
Yeah, and you have tips about how to shop.
Tips about how to shop because people didn't know then. You know, they hadn't been to a farmer's market, and they didn't know what to do, and they were shy and awkward. So, and I told a lot of stories too about farming and how someone could, for example, I was at a farm once and I saw black clouds come up, and then there was a hailstorm, and that farmer lost his entire crop of greens for that season. And our season's very short here in New Mexico, so it really made a difference. And it always makes a difference no matter where you are. Hail can wipe out a crop in no time at all. And people aren't very tolerant about eating hail-damaged whatevers, which is why in vegetable literacy I put that hail-damaged recipe in, because if you do grow food yourself, you have this tenderness towards it that you might not have if you were buying it in the store or at the farmer's market. And so if it has hail damage, you're going to use it. You find a way.
Yeah. I think that book really kind of. See, I thought, because really we became associated through Slow Food, I thought of you more as an activist, and that book seemed more activist oriented than just, it's not a cookbook per se. It's a book about a phenomenon, as you said. It was emerging. I think I remember there were like 3,000 farmers markets then, and I know in the new book, in Onion in My Pocket, you talk about the fact that there's 7,000 or 6,000 now. So
or 9.
yeah, I mean, it's got
there are
huge,
a lot more.
right? A lot more, and actually, that hurts the markets in some ways because they're competing against each other in a way they didn't when you wrote the book. But yeah, it's an incredible, it's a really beautiful book too. I think the pictures are great, and yeah, so it's a nice. Is that where I got a nettle? Is there a nettle soup?
There might be. I can't remember.
That's where I learned how to do nettle soup.
I'm not looking at my books right now,
Right.
so I can't remember what's in them. But there may well be a nettle soup in some, at least in some book I've read. I love nettle soups, actually.
Yeah, me too.
And I did go up to a farmer. Actually, I think there is a nettle soup and a couple of nettle dishes, maybe because I had gone to the Nettles farm up in Lummi Island. And they laughed when I called them and I said, I was wondering if you had any nettles. Well, they named it that because they had to clear 5 acres of nettles before they could start anything. And so I went up there and they made nettle pasta, and it was green as an Iron Park bench. It was so dark, and nettle this, nettle that. So we had a good time with nettles and with seafood and with all kinds of
nettles are amazing. Yeah. Well, I want to talk about another book. The third book I got, and I think actually Patrick, your husband, might have given it to me. What We Eat When We Eat Alone. Yeah, and you talk about it briefly as kind of the sales were disappointing because the crash happened, the 2007-8 crash, right when it came out. And I remember you introduced me to the publisher, Gibbs Smith. Gibbs Smith at one point, and I talked to him. But I like that book because it goes back to this thing about paying attention, which is one of the attributes of Buddhism, paying attention. This book is about paying attention to other people and what they do when they eat alone. Do you want to talk about that book?
Sure. Well, it actually came out of an Old Ways trip experience.
Yeah, tell people what Old Ways is. They may not know.
Old Ways Preservation and Trust was, at that time, a group that took a lot of food writers and chefs and people around to Mediterranean countries to look at Mediterranean diets and the old ways of doing things, basically. And Patrick would go on these trips with me, and everybody had a biography, and so he knew you couldn't ask, somebody, what do you do, for example? You wouldn't ask Claudia Roden that, and or Paula Wolford or whomever. And so he would ask people, what do you eat when you eat alone? And he took notes on it. And I didn't know about it for the longest time. And I found them one day when we were moving, and I said, what are these? And he said, oh, there's some notes I took on those Old Ways trips. And I said, they're great. They would be so interesting in a book. So eventually he did decide that he would illustrate it. And in fact, he designed and did the whole book himself. And it's a beautiful little book.
It is.
Don't you?
Yeah, I love this little book.
But we between us, we just asked everybody we met, what do you eat when you eat alone? And we asked a range of people, from people you sat next to on an airplane, to kids, to grown-ups, to grandparents, to chefs, to all kinds of people, and bartenders, and people who you end up talking with for one reason or another. And we collected their recipes, and then it just fell into chapters. Women were very different from men, for example. Kids were very different from their parents, and so on and so forth. And it was a fun book to do, and we're still married. That's the amazing thing.
Right. Yeah. You have a really beautiful way, that kind of partnership, the way you work together in marriage. It's nice to see. And the drawings that he does, I mean, he's a great artist. And it's so funny. I noticed yesterday when I was looking through the book again that he calls himself a journeyman painter. In the flap on the back where it describes you two as the authors, and he says Patrick McFarlane is a journeyman painter. And I was like, I looked up journeyman, and I thought he's way beyond. He's a master painter. He can paint anything. Do you know why? Do you know why he called himself a journeyman painter?
No, I don't. You'll have to ask him.
I'm going to have to ask him that. That's
Maybe
funny.
because he's been doing it for a long time and he wouldn't call himself a master.
Yeah. Well, it's amazing. It's a fun little book, and I hope more people find that book because it's a fun book to have. And I remember one of the stories about a guy. He's a police officer who makes a bolognese sauce. And talks about his bolognese, and he uses the term mise en place, and I'm like, how would a cop know that term? That's so funny.
Well, he had another background too. In addition to being a detective.
Oh, that's so funny.
Yeah.
Let's talk about vegetable literacy, because that is an amazing book. It is not a cook. I mean, do you describe it as a cookbook?
Well, I originally didn't even want to put recipes in it, but I'm kind of glad that they went in because it gives people a handle to cook, with these vegetables. So yeah, but I never thought of it as a cookbook. I don't think of anything as a cookbook.
Tell people what it is.
Well, it takes a look at 12 botanical families that contain most of the vegetables that we're familiar with, and it just opens each family up as to, it's really botany light. I mean, it's so light, it floats, but it describes, for example, the different families and what their members are and how they work together, and I like to think that if you didn't know anything about vegetables, you would find ways to improvise. For example, Chenopodiaceae, which includes chard and chilices and spinach and other greens. They're mostly beet greens, for example. They can be used together or to replace one another. You just have to to cook them a little longer, or to use a little more or a little less, or whatever. But the recipes try to clarify that too.
Well, the thing I like about for instance, I had this flower that was coming out in my year. It comes out in my yard every year. It still does. I didn't know what it was. It looks kind of like a thistle. It turns out it's Western salsify, which you write about as a food. I never knew that. And so it just grows in my garden. So, my house is 107 years old, and it was Italian immigrants that worked in the canneries here in Santa Rosa. It was built for the cannery workers. So there's all these seeds that are still in the soil, probably by what people planted or whatever, and they still grow.
That's interesting. And the salsify also makes a dandelion type of flower. I spend hours digging them up because I grew all these plants, for the book to find out what they were really like. And we have two kinds of salsify, the big mammoth salsify, which has a beautiful purple daisy-like flower, and the one you're describing, which has a smaller yellow flower. But they both do what dandelions do, and they make a lot of seeds and they multiply. Yeah. And during the pandemic, I spent most of my spring digging up salsify, actually.
Yeah.
But it is a really pretty plant, and yes, you can eat it, and it's great with brown butter, as it turns out. But I'm not sure I would suggest that anybody plant it. It fell out of favor a long time ago, but it's good to know in case we really need to eat what we see around us, and that you can eat it and you can cook it, and it is good.
It is good. I mean, it's the other thing about the book is it has origins. You say it's botany light. Maybe that's because your father was a botanist, another through line. And here's this book, botany light. But I mean, for a person like me who knows, a fair amount about cooking and food because of my world, what I work in, I found it enriching.
And you're a really good cook too.
Well, thank you. But I really enjoyed. This book because of the depth. I mean, and what strikes me is how much stuff comes from Russia. And I mean, the term Russia comes up a lot in the book, and Russian, different types of
Really?
foods. Yeah, it's very interesting. But I think of what was that great botanist, Gary Nabhan always talks about him. He wrote a book about him, I think, or an
Oh,
article.
Vavilov.
Vavilov,
Yeah.
yeah. And the great Russian botanist who went around the world and identified where everything came from. I mean, maybe that's why so many things are named after Russia or connected to Russia somehow. It's interesting to me. But it's a great book. Dan Imhoff, I had dinner with he and Quincy last night, and Dan said, "Oh, I love that book, Vegetable Literacy. It's fantastic." And it's on their shelf in their kitchen. I see it. Because it's enlightening. And it's a book that shows about paying attention. The whole thing about lettuces and the white, when you cut a lettuce and that white sap comes out, that it was people used it like laudanum. It was connected to a drug. I mean, I didn't realize any of that.
Yeah, it is. Latuga, the milk part.
Yeah, that's fascinating to me. And
yeah, and I love the stories about tomatoes and potatoes, and especially about the potato. Because it's such a maligned vegetable, and it has so much in terms of story about it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, you and Michael Pollan, right? He wrote a whole section of a book about potatoes. I remember that.
That's right.
Yeah. So it's a fantastic book. And then, as I've said to you in the past, In My Kitchen, which prior to An Onion in My Pocket was the last book I think that I got from you. I think there is a book in between maybe that you did. But In My Kitchen, I think it came out in 2017, and we did an event here with you in Healdsburg where you came and read.
Oh, that's right, I did.
And we had a really beautiful lunch. And that is absolutely a gorgeous book. And Vegetable Literacy is gorgeous too. You can see the evolution of books, how they're designed. Culinary books, they've really become quite sophisticated and beautiful, haven't they?
They have. Although I do have a little problem with vegetable photography or cookbook photography, which is now it's all from above. Everything is taken from above. And I think it's because that's how we now see the world with the iPhone. We can take that picture. And I think it's one of the reasons bowls are so popular. Is they're very photogenic, but I think photographs can really date a book terribly, and so I found it kind of ironic that I don't have any photographs or drawings or pictures at all in the newly revised Vegetarian Cooking for Everyone, and it seems to work. But I do love the photographs in these books. I think they're beautiful. In the two you mentioned, Vegetable Literacy and In My Kitchen. And I hope they won't be dated, and I hope they'll last a long time.
Yeah, so talk about In My Kitchen, why you did In My Kitchen.
Well, I was really done. I thought I was done writing cookbooks. And then Jenny Wapner, who was my editor at 10 Speed, had wanted to do a more narrative book. And so she said, yeah, let's do that. And I said, well, I was thinking of recipes that were more like just a paragraph or something that you'd write about. But instead, we did this book. And a lot of the recipes are, and I'm looking at it right now, are somewhat familiar in that I've done them before, but they were updated. And some of them were new and some of them were not. They all have about a page of writing that introduces them, which was really fun for me to do.
Yeah, I think actually when I think of your books, I think of the writing. I think of the voice you have, which comes out beautifully in An Onion in My Pocket. The thing I really like about this book is it's so honest. Your personality really comes out in it. I mean, I think you really like to do things really well, and you have anxiety about doing it well, and you talk about that in here. And then you're critical of things. I mean, bowls. You kind of you're kind of critical of bowls. Everybody's interested in bowls now. So
yeah,
that's
I know.
It's refreshing. I like that. And I've read some of the reviews of the book, and I think other people have noticed that and enjoy that. And it's got a sense of humor, and it really captures your journey, your incredible kind of arc of your life. I mean, so are you going to write future books? Are you going to write more books?
Well, maybe. I don't know for sure. But I always look at what's on my desktop, and I have a folder called 72 Labors, which is mentioned in the book because it always so impressed me. And I have a number of essays in there about foods that we just take for granted, but we don't understand necessarily where they come from, how they got here, how they grow, and so forth. So I might do that book. I don't know yet.
It's kind of like a vegetable literacy, local flavors, a sense of like it's a journey, it's a discovery. It's not just a cookbook then.
No, I'm not even sure there would be recipes in it.
Wow.
No, there might be.
Wow.
There might be. I don't know. Yeah. I don't know. I have to get through launching this book first before I can really.
Yeah, it's only been out a week to 10 days, right?
Yeah, less than that.
Yeah.
I think it's 5 days or so.
It's 5 days, my God. So, one of the things that's really interesting, I mean, you talk about it a lot, actually, and not just this book, in other books, in Local Flavors and in other books, about this tension that arises around people thinking of you as a vegetarian or only eating vegetables. But, and you talk about the fact that so many of your friends are ranchers and you have all this meat in your freezer and that you get from people. And when I've been in your home, I mean, the meat meals are delicious and always balanced with all these other things. So, why don't you just talk a little bit about how you deal with that kind of, not conflict, but it's a tension.
It is a tension. And, people are not going to ever let me be who I am, I feel, because they think I'm a vegetarian. And it's understandable because Greens was a vegetarian restaurant. I'm kind of a natural vegetarian. I enjoy that sort of food. But I do feel it's important that we be able to understand what other people are about, and that includes meat eaters and ranchers and everybody. And my own husband, who had cancer recently, has a huge appetite for meat right now, and he was raised with meat. I wasn't particularly, so there's a big difference, between us in that way. But wow. Yeah, ranchers are food people too. They're generous, and that's why I had all that meat in my freezer that I wrote about. I hadn't bought any of it; it was just given to me, and I'm very grateful for it. Because if I'm going to feed Patrick meat, I want it to be of really good quality, which means mainly grass-fed, grass-finished, and local to me. So, but in this book, I wanted to, in a way, tell people about that nourishment and food really comes from a kindness and generosity with people, not just a dietary limitation. And so, hence those last stories in the book.
Nourishment. Yeah, that's a beautiful.
Like Ernie's.
Yeah, like Ernie's. There's a section, and maybe we should end with this. But one more thing I wanted to say about the meat thing. Like you said, the natural world needs animals. It needs animals that eat grass. And wasn't your father like an expert in grasses?
Yeah, that
was a
was
botanist.
But turf grasses.
Turf grasses. Okay.
Yeah.
So anyway, the thing that's interesting to me is that there's been so many attacks on meat in recent years for different reasons, but because of industrial agriculture, industrial meat processing, industrial meat systems is destructive in many ways. But there is this movement to balance it, and there's incredible things about meat that so much energy and nutrition comes from an animal that eats grass that humans can't eat. We can't eat grass, and most of the world is grassland. So we're going to have to make peace with it, and I think you do a really good job of describing that in several of the places in your writing, of the relationship of ranchers to the food system, And
Well, I think they do play a very important role. I mean, and they can play a very positive role too. And I do cite one rancher who returned water to her land by, digging up the plants that have long, long taproots that drink a lot of water.
Right?
Juniper.
Yeah. Let's close. I was thinking there was a piece that you could read that is also in the nourishment section, which is, I think I said, is my favorite section of the book, just because it's so, that generosity you were talking about, that ranchers have, that farmers have. I mean, Don Bustos, I remember I met Don Bustos, but the first time I ever read about him was in Local Flavors, I think. You quote him or you talk about him at some event there. And then I ended up on a panel with him sometime. And, he's kind of a crusty farmer in a certain way, but he has another piece of him that's kind of really thoughtful and generous about the relationship between farmers and culture and farmers and community. And so there's a section, I don't know if you have the same page numbers in the book that you have, but it would be page 284 in the section.
284.
Yeah,
okay.
It's the section called Meals with Ann and Arnold.
Sure.
There's the penultimate paragraph, the one right before the last paragraph. It begins, "Where did it come from?" I love this paragraph. I circled this paragraph in the book. It kind of captures so much of the spirit.
And then I go on in the book to even flesh it out more than that at the very, very end. But would you like me to read that paragraph?
If you would. I think it's a beautiful way to end in the sense that it captures the feeling so much about this book. So, yeah, please. And we'll end with
Okay, so let me just explain who Ann and Arnold were and who they are, because they're wonderful people. And they lived in Flagstaff, and they are people who actually succeeded in growing a lot of food in a very difficult climate and not much space. They had a ranch home, and I ate with them often. And they were very kind of humble cooks in a way. They weren't foodies, but I always loved being with them and the food that they served. And I felt very, very nourished by their food.
Mm-hmm.
So I write, where did it come from, this feeling of being well fed, nourished? I suspect from calmness, intention, maybe not having tons of foodstuffs in the house given the limits of Flagstaff. Instead, there was the bounty from the garden. Ann and Arnold were not foodies, but simply people who cooked their meals whether busy or stressed, sad or happy. In no way was this modern food or stylish food, and it completely didn't matter. What did matter was the feeling of calmness that imbued their kitchen. And I have to say, if I can go on, when I think of a standard to hold myself to, theirs are the meals I think of.
Wow.
Not that I make the same food. I don't. But what speaks to me is a more elusive quality of attention to detail and of quiet intention that made these meals so deeply nourishing. That's what I strive for.
Yes, and I was going to say that in your kitchen, that's what it's like. I just sitting in the kitchen at that table with Patrick, and then watching you cook, and the conversations. It's calm and it's warm, and the aromas that are coming from the plates. It's beautiful, and the cooking, the pans. I think you do achieve that. I think you do.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I hope so.
Yeah.
It is. I mean, I often do think of those meals, and they were so simple and so good and so nourishing. And anyway, I talk about a lot of meals like that.
Yeah, you do, and that why that section is so. It's like they're like short stories. They're like short stories, and you can see them and feel them and even smell it kind of when you're reading it. So it's fabulous. So anyway, I want to.
And two of them, I wasn't even present at. Dan's mother when she died. I wasn't there,
right.
And I wasn't there when the woman had the bat mitzvah for her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
But it doesn't matter. I mean, we wrote, we talked,
mm-hmm.
There's so many ways you can experience food, and you don't always have to be present for it.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is a beautiful thing. And I want to thank you for the time. It was a wonderful conversation. Really appreciated it.
Thank you, Michael.
And,
I appreciate it too.
Yeah, and before we started recording, we talked about the windstorm you've been having. I hope it doesn't get worse. The winds are amazing.
I hope not too.
Yeah, and I know.
Yeah, it's starting to pick up again a little bit.
Is it? Wow. We're getting some rain finally, and that's a good thing too. So.
Oh, good for you. Aren't you lucky? We haven't had no moisture at all.
Oh. Well, give my best to Patrick and sending you big hugs, and we'll talk soon, I hope. Hey, this is Michael. As you know, Flipping the Table is sponsored by Roots of Change. You can keep our program going by making a contribution to Roots of Change through our website, rootsofchange.org.